The Astronauts, continued by Stanislaw Lem, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The report. In 2003, the Sahara was already largely irrigated by the Mediterranean. Gibraltar's hydroelectric power plants supplied electrical energy to the North African power grid for the first time. Unhindered by any borders, the continental high-voltage grids expanded. Nuclear power plants were built, deserted, fully automated factories. In photochemical transmitters, solar energy converted carbon dioxide and water into sugar. The secret of this process, which had been taking place in plants for millions of years, had become the property of humans. It almost seemed as if the irrigation of the Sahara and the harnessing of the Mediterranean gradient in Gibraltar's turbines were undertakings that would remain unsurpassed for a long time. But just a year later, work began on a new project, the sheer audacity of which even eclipsed the Gibraltar North African Hydro Combine. The International Bureau for Climate Regulation moved from modest local attempts to influence the weather, direct rain clouds, and the movement of air masses to a frontal assault against humanity's main enemy, the cold that had clung to the planet's polar caps for untold millions of years. Like a shield hundreds of meters thick, the eternal ice covered the Arctic, 1/6 of the Earth, enclosed Greenland and the entire archipelago of the Arctic Ocean, and also formed the source of the cold ocean currents that cooled the northern shores of Asia and America. This ice shield was to disappear forever. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to warm vast areas of the oceans and continents and melt thousands of cubic kilometers of ice. Such tremendous energy could never have been extracted from uranium. The reserves of the basic material were far too small. Meanwhile, however, astronomy, which had long been considered a science alien to life, had discovered the energy source that sustains the unquenchable fire of the stars, the conversion of hydrogen into helium through atomic fission. Free hydrogen is scarcely present in the Earth's crust and atmosphere, but the oceans form an inexhaustible reservoir of this element. The scholars' idea was simple. Near the poles, enormous atomic fires of solar temperature should generate heat and light in the icy desert. The difficulties that stood in the way of the realization of this project initially seemed insurmountable. It turned out that no material was capable of withstanding the temperatures of several million degrees released during the splitting of the hydrogen atom. Durable fire bricks tested asbestos, quartz, mica, the finest tungsten steel, everything instantly turned to steam upon contact with the blindingly bright, tremendously heat-radiating atomic fire. They certainly possessed an energy source that would make it possible to melt the ice masses, warm oceans, even dry out entire seas, change the climate, and create tropical jungles at the poles. But they lacked the building materials for the corresponding combustion centers. Moreover, they had come to the realization that it would be far too dangerous to set such atomic fires on Earth. The unleashed heat would melt the Earth's surface, eat into its depths, and cause unimaginable catastrophes. But since nothing can stop humanity when it comes to achieving its set goal, even this barrier was not ignored. If it wasn't possible to confine the energy source to Earth, then it had to be relocated to the atmosphere. The scientists decided to create artificial polar suns in the form of glowing gas spheres a few hundred meters in diameter, which would be fed by hydrogen blowers. Energy centers would generate the powerful electromagnetic force fields at a safe distance to keep the artificial suns at the desired altitude. In the first phase of the melting operations, which were expected to last 20 years, in northern Greenland, on Grantland, Franz Josef Land, and in Siberia, construction began on power plants that would supply the energy for the control system and together form the so-called atomic control circuit. Soon, entire factories were moving on wheels and caterpillar trucks into the icy, deserted, mountainous regions. Machines cleared the taiga and leveled the construction site. Machines generated the heat to thaw the ground that had been frozen for millions of years. Machines laid prefabricated concrete blocks from which high-rise building foundations, dams, and protective walls were built in the glacial valleys. Machines moving on steel feet, diggers, excavators, drilling rigs, cranes, tractors, conveyor belts worked day and night. Right behind them, other machines moved forward. They erected high-voltage power lines, transformer stations, residential buildings, and built entire cities within airfields, where the first large transport aircraft immediately landed. The attention these projects attracted was immense. The whole world looked to the far north, where, amidst cold and snowstorms, in temperatures that dropped to 60 degrees below zero, one drilling rig after another, and the steel antennas of the atomic ring were rising, which would in the future guide the free-floating, glowing platinum-glowing hydrogen spheres. One of the construction sites was the stony Tunguska region, amidst marl and clay walls which had been excavated from the rock-hard, perpetually frozen ground in deep excavations. Catapulting stations were mounted on mighty concrete pillars. Rocket planes had already replaced the railway. During this work, an excavator extracted a large block of earth from the bottom of the approximately 7-meter deep shaft. The block tumbled onto the conveyor belt, entered the pan mill, where the larger stones were ground into fine gravel and became stuck. The powerful machine stopped immediately. When the operator increased the speed, when the machine was switched, the gears made of the hardest cement, steel, creaked and several teeth broke off. The machine was taken apart and a boulder was noticed wedged between two rollers. It was so hard that it could hardly be scratched even with the best files. By chance, some scientists heard about the discovery. They examined the mysterious boulder and took it with them. The next day it was already in the laboratory of an institute for meteor research. Initially they thought they were looking at a meteor. However, it turned out to be a block of basalt of terrestrial origin, into which a roller, pointed at both ends, had been melted. It was reminiscent of a grenade in size and shape and consisted of two parts that were irreparably screwed together. The casing had to be cut through to reach the interior. Only after long efforts, even the Institute of Applied Physics was consulted, did the scientists succeed in uncovering the secret of this metal casing. Inside was a coil of porcelain-like molten material, around which an almost 5-kilometer long wire made of a steel-like alloy was wound. Nothing more. Just 4 days later, an international committee began examining this coil. Very soon it was discovered that the wound wire had been magnetized. The upper windings had already lost their magnetism, apparently under the influence of high temperatures. The deeper layers were still well preserved. The scholars indulged in all sorts of speculations about the origin of the mysterious coil. No one dared to be the first to voice a suspicion that was on everyone's mind. Only a chemical analysis of the material from which the wire was made brought clarity. Such an alloy was never produced anywhere on Earth. The creature-like body must therefore have some connection with the once famous Tungus meteor. No one knew who had first uttered it, but suddenly the word report was circulating. Indeed, the wire was so magnetized as if it were inscribed along its entire length with electrical vibrations, a unique interplanetary letter. It was reminiscent of the recording of a steel tape, as had long been the custom in radio and telephone systems. Very soon, the assumption spread that the occupants of the unknown spaceship had tried to save what they considered most valuable at the critical moment when the engines refused to obey. Therefore, they had jettisoned this document, held in place by magnetic vibrations on a wire, before the catastrophe. But there was no shortage of other voices claiming that the coil had been ejected from the ship's hull by the explosion. As proof, they cited the obvious change in the surface under the influence of high temperatures. In the daily press, as well as in scientific journals, There were long discussions about the origin of the spaceship. There was probably no planet in our solar system that wasn't suspected of having sent it. Even distant Uranus and giant Jupiter weren't excluded. On the whole, however, opinions were divided into two camps: Venus and, almost twice as strong, Mars. Never before had astronomy had as many followers as it did this year. Incredibly high circulations of popular and even scientific books were published, and the demand for amateur astronomical instruments, especially telescopes, rose to such an extent that the best stocks were sold out. Fantastic novels appeared about mysterious creatures on Mars to which the authors attributed the most astonishing characteristics. Some television stations included special astronomy programs in their weekly schedules. A Berlin television broadcast, The Journey to the Moon, enjoyed extraordinary success and was picked up by all stations in the Northern Hemisphere. Viewers at home were able to view the surface of the Moon at 3,000 times magnification. As the television broadcasters, the International Translation Commission, which had since been formed, began its famous battle with the wire, as the special scientific correspondent of the Times called it. The work of the best Egyptologists and Sanskrit researchers, the specialists in dead and lost languages, seemed like child's play compared to the task that awaited those scholars. The pattern was composed of more than 80 billion magnetic oscillations captured in the crystalline structure of the metal wire. The individual groups of these oscillations were separated from each other by short intervals of non-magnetized wire. The involuntary thought that each group represented a word occurred. This assumption, however, could just as easily be erroneous. If the alleged pattern was nothing more than a recording of various measuring instruments, even if verbal communications were abolished, many scientists judged the structure of its language could be completely different from that of all languages known on Earth. But even those scholars agreed that such an opportunity, which was presenting itself to science for the first time in history, could not be missed under any circumstances. The most difficult part was the beginning. When the Commission began its work, its entire material consisted of a coil of magnetized wire. First, the entire wire was passed through an apparatus that registered the magnetic vibrations on a strip of film. The valuable original was placed in the underground vault, while the scholars from then on worked exclusively with the film copies. During the initial deliberations, it was decided to pursue the only path that promised success. The words of every language are symbols that denote specific objects and concepts. Therefore, the decipherment of the languages of extinct peoples, of ciphers, and similar cryptograms is based on rules common to all languages. One first searches for symbols, which occur most frequently. One examines whether the language in question has a pictorial, letter-like, or syllabic character, and most importantly, one looks for a clue that makes it possible to understand at least the meaning of an expression. In earlier cases, researchers had usually been helped by a lucky coincidence. For example, the same text had once been found carved on a tombstone, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and in Greek script. A similar situation occurred with the decipherment of Babylonian cuneiform. In all cases, however, there was one fundamental point. The creators of these unknown languages had been human, just like the researchers. They had once lived on the same planet, under the same sun, they had seen the same stars, the same axes of vegetation, the sea, the same conditions of existence were favorable for the formation of universally valid symbols. Things were quite different now. What concepts could these unknown beings and humans have in common? At what point would one have to build a bridge over the abyss that separated the creatures of different celestial bodies? There was only one connecting link: matter. The entire universe, from the smallest grain of sand beneath our feet to the most distant stars, is made up of the same atoms. In all, even the most hidden corners, matter is governed by the same laws, and they can all be expressed in formulas with the help of mathematics. If mathematics means the expressions were used in writing the report, the scientists told themselves, then there was a chance. In any other case, the report would remain undeciphered forever. The idea of approaching the solution from this perspective, however, represented only the first step on an incredibly difficult and long path. It might have seemed that one only needed to check the report with regard to the most important physical laws, But that was at this time not possible, especially since there were too few such laws. The worst thing was that no one knew what kind of logarithmic system the authors had used. The decimal system, which consists of 9 base numbers and 0, seemed obvious only to the layman, but is by no means so for the mathematician. We have adopted it because we have 10 fingers on our hands, and in times long past our hands served as calculating machines. Theoretically, however, any number of such systems is possible, from the binary system in which only 2 numbers, 1 and 0, exist, through the triple, quadruple, quintuple, and so on ad infinitum. During its work, the Translation Commission limited itself for practical purposes to 79 systems, from the binary to the 86 system. The task, therefore, was to examine millions of magnetic oscillations, and for each of these oscillations to calculate its value in 79 number systems. This alone resulted in approximately 1 trillion calculations, but it was only the beginning, for the results obtained still had to be verified, and among them, those that corresponded to physical constants had to be selected. There were several hundred such constants, as charges, atomic weight, and elements, but even that was not enough. In the vast sea of numbers, results could be found that corresponded quite by chance to some constants. Therefore, control calculations also had to be performed. The totality of this work, which constituted only the beginning of the actual translation, had occupied thousands of the best mathematicians throughout their lives, but it was accomplished in the course of 27 days. The Translation Commission had at its disposal the world's largest electronic brain at the time, a powerful machine that occupied 4 floors of the Mathematical Institute in Berlin. The work of this gigantic thinking apparatus was directed from a central office located on the top floor of the Institute. From there, a staff of specialists gave the electronic brain the command to examine all the signs of the reports and to determine analogies of physical constants among them. In each individual case, it was to carry out this task in all 79 number systems, check the results thus obtained, record each subsection of its work, and immediately announce the result. The headquarters was a round hall made of white marble. Green fluorescent screens flickered on the walls, on which the results of the ongoing operations could be read. From the moment the first perforated strips containing the commands disappeared into the depths of the mechanism and the signal lamps lit up, until the moment the red pilot lights went out, 643 hours of uninterrupted work had passed. The electronic brain had performed 5 million calculations per second without a single pause, while the scientists on duty changed 6 times a day. It is impossible to convey the sheer magnitude of the work accomplished. It is sufficient to mention that the language of the report was less reminiscent of the spoken sounds than of an unusual music, for what corresponded to earthly words was expressed there by various tones. On several occasions, even the enormous capacity of the electronic brain proved insufficient to perform all the necessary calculations. In such cases, fuses switched on underground cables that connected the central brain to other electronic brains in Germany. Finally, the moment came when the results appeared on the fluorescent screens. High-pitched buzzing tones alerted headquarters, but the scientists on duty had already jumped up from their desks when they saw the first decipherment of the report within human comprehension. The first sentence that appeared on the fluorescent screen read silicon, oxygen, aluminium, oxygen, nitrogen, oxygen. This essentially meant Earth. After 4 repetitions, the term oxygen was replaced by a varying number of vibrations were produced. The scientists concluded that this passage was about the physical properties of the Earth. Silicon and aluminium oxides are the main components of the Earth's crust. Oxygen and nitrogen form the air, and hydrogen and oxygen the oceans. This seemingly simple sentence, however, meant considerably more. First, terms like silicon, aluminium, and oxygen contained certain symbols which, in conjunction with a formula, had to designate matter per se. Second, this entire sentence, consisting of 8 expressions, was subordinate to a certain higher function, corresponding to that of a curved surface. It was the formula for the surface of a sphere, the sphere's crust. From now on, deciphering the report became easier, although there were not a lack of passages that sparked bitter discussions. As the work progressed, the overall picture of the Earth and the universe became increasingly clearer, seen for the first time in history by beings other than humans. The report consisted of several parts. The first contained the physical description of the Earth, the relief of the land masses, the structure of continents and oceans, and the chemical composition of the Earth's crust. No difficulties arose here. The first disagreement between the translators arose when they reached a point where the report reported on Earth's cities. Despite the great speed and altitude of their flight, the unknown beings had managed to observe the rational cultivation of our planet, the factories, houses, streets, and even the people in the fields and streets. One thing, however, remained puzzling. Why, in the description of the perceived phenomena, were humans treated as the most insignificant? They seemed not to be assigned the role of builders and designers of earthly civilization. The report described humans as long drops and considered them particles of some larger uniform mass, a flexible soft substance, from which they could only temporarily detach themselves in the form of those drops. This mass must have been familiar to the authors of the report, for they expressed the assumption that people consisted of a similar substance. To here followed an untranslatable concept that does not appear in any of the earthly languages. In the next part of the report, cities, residential buildings, and various other facilities, such as the railway network, train stations, port facilities, were described so precisely that the readers felt great admiration for the precision of the observation instruments that the occupants of the spaceship must have used. Here, too, the description was based on the same completely incomprehensible inversion of concepts. The authors of the report eagerly searched for the creators of Earth's technological civilization without even suspecting them in humans. That they had noticed humans was beyond doubt. For a few sentences later, they mentioned a fairly large number of long drops are creeping around in the field of vision. After a careful examination of this part of the report, the scientists came to the conclusion that this reversal of concepts, this misunderstanding, was by no means a coincidence, but rather concealed the secret of the unknown beings. They were led to a new, albeit not very distinct, lead by a brief remark later in the report. The authors of the report reiterated their opinion that they could not find creators of the technical devices anywhere, and added, perhaps because they here followed the intransmissible term again, dimensions, this very enigmatic concept could be the key to solving the mystery. The assumption that it could be an adjective, such as small or tiny, had to be rejected, since in the language of the report adjectives were expressed by differently shaped magnetic vibrations. But if it were a pronoun, the sentence could perhaps read, because they are of our dimension. Further investigations showed that the smallest objects that the unknown beings could notice were 7 to 8 centimeters in size. If the authors, therefore, suspected that they could not discover the creators of terrestrial civilization only because of their dimensions, this implied that the unknown beings themselves were relatively small, in any case no larger than 8 centimeters. This remained the only place in the report from which their size could be deduced. Unfortunately, this assumption proved to be as false, for in the language of the report, not a single pronoun such as we, I, our, and so on was found. In the last part of the report, the translators increasingly encountered white spots, that is, places that could no longer be read due to a weakening of the magnetic recordings. In addition, more and more concepts emerged that could not be deciphered by analyzing the vibrations. Here, the trial and error method, the insertion of probable concepts, a method used with stubborn patience by the mixed group of mathematicians and linguists, also failed. The report concluded with a brief factual description of the catastrophe that ended the spacecraft's flight. It contained readings from the measuring instruments, a vastly increasing rate of atomic decay, a tremendous rise in temperature, malfunctions in the propulsion motors. Then the magnetic symbols became unclear. There followed a short blank strip, and finally only 2 clearly legible words: fuse blown. As we already mentioned, the scholars already knew the general outline of the content. since the translation of the still puzzling passages, apart from details, would probably not bring anything fundamentally new, the Translation Commission moved on to the next phase of its work. It divided itself into 3 sections, each of which addressed a specific problem. The first, chaired by Professor Clover, was tasked with collecting and expanding all material on the unknown entities. This section consisted primarily of natural scientists, that is, biologists, zoologists, botanists, and physicians, specialists in the field of the young, promisingly developing science of astrobiology, which investigated life phenomena, other celestial bodies, was also represented in this group of scholars. The second section checked the translation of the report and compared it with the original, the famous magnetic wire that had been retrieved from the safe of the Institute for Meteor Research. The third section worked on the sections of the report that had not yet been deciphered. It was primarily made up of mathematics and physicists. They held their meetings primarily in the center of the electronic brain and ordered it to continuously digest the most complex calculations. This even led to a minor clash with the biologists, who claimed that the physicists had monopolized the institute and made it impossible for others to use the electronic brain. While millions of people around the world were able to learn about the content of the published part of the report, thanks to radio, the press, and television, a turn of events occurred in the further course of the work within the Translation Committee that no one had expected. The impetus for what appeared to be the most important discovery came from a discussion in the biological section, to which the famous Indian mathematician Chandrasekhar had been invited as a guest and advisor. One of the scholars started from the previously mentioned section of the report, which seemed to indicate the astonishingly small size of the unknown entities. He argued that they were insects living in communities, creatures like bees or ants, but with incomparably higher intelligence. The chairman of the section, Professor Clover, replied, "Great intelligence requires a large brain, however. Insects unable to develop a larger brain that will be suited to their other body dimensions. Their respiratory organs could not supply sufficient oxygen to a body whose size exceeds a few centimeters. This is also the real reason why no very large insects live or ever lived." His opponent objected that the respiratory system of the unknown creatures could be completely different. Professor Clover, in turn, considered that, in his opinion, insects that possess a different nervous and respiratory system than insects are no longer insects. One could just as well call animals plants equipped with nervous, circulatory, and muscular systems, for what characteristics would then remain in either case other than the empty name? A heated discussion ensued in which both sides staunchly defended their arguments. One could have already assumed that the evening would end up in a fruitless argument when Professor Chandrasekhar, who had previously listened silently, asked to speak. "I came here with a very specific idea," he said. "Perhaps it will shed some light on the problem under discussion. I examined the eyewitness accounts of the fall of the Tunguska meteor very carefully. In all of them, it was observed that during the meteor's appearance, the shadows of trees and houses elongated in the opposite direction to the meteor's flight. From this it follows the report, or at least its conclusion, could not have been written by living beings." This statement astonished those present. Their eyes followed the mathematician, who stepped up to a blackboard, took a larger piece of chalk from the box, and immediately began his proof. At the moment of the catastrophe, the sun was shining. Therefore, if objects in sunny places cast shadows in the light of the spaceship, then this light was stronger than that of the sun. From this it follows that the temperature of the ship's hull must also be higher than that of the sun. The period during which the ship was in Earth's atmosphere had been known. From this information, the professor calculated that regardless of the rocket's mantle thickness, a temperature of no less than 600 degrees Celsius had prevailed inside. Naturally, no living creature could withstand such heat. However, the report had been recorded throughout the entire flight up until the movement of the disaster. This indicates, the professor continued, that either automatic instruments were the cause, or there was no one in the space rocket at all, or that the unknown creatures represented a completely different organism than that of animals or plants. The biologists had listened to Chandrasekhar's explanations with rapt attention. Since they accepted his evidence, they decided to inform the full assembly of the Translation Committee about it the next day. However, when they appeared in the small hall of the Institute the next morning, they, along with the other scientists, were summoned to the large lecture hall for an extraordinary meeting with the secret agenda. This aroused general astonishment, since such strict measures had never been taken during the Commission's work to date. The meeting took place behind closed doors, without the guests usually invited. Professor Ramon E. Cowell of the Instituto Nacional de Astronomía in Veracruz presided over the deliberations that day. He announced that the third section had made a discovery in the course of its work, the immediate verification of which was extremely important, since the fate of the entire Earth could depend on the outcome. He then gave the floor to Professor Zhu. The Chinese physicist did not speak from his seat through the microphone, as was usual, but instead climbed onto the presidential podium. In his voice, not very loud but clearly audible throughout the hall, he explained that he had been authorized by the third section to present to the esteemed assembly a discovery whose significance could not yet be estimated. The grand words with which Professor Raymond E. Cowell's introduction to the lecture surprised no one. The old Mexican astronomer's idyllic temperature was well known. In contrast, the physicist's very first sentences electrified everyone present. Lao Tzu was known as one of the most sober and critical thinkers on the Translation Committee. Lao Tzu reported that the third section had succeeded in making those wire sections of the report whose magnetization had become unrecognizable. Readable using X-ray photography, he then announced the text of the section that could be deciphered using this new method. It read, "After the second element of revolution, the irradiation of the planet is recorded. When the intensity of the ionization has fallen by half, the great movement begins." There was complete silence in the densely packed hall. Not a breath, not even the habitual creaking of the chairs could be heard. Some of the scientists had closed their eyes in anticipation and were holding their headphones to their ears with both hands. Others were furiously jotting down the Chinese physicist's words. After repeating the translated passage twice, Lao Tzu explained that the third section was inclined to understand the text as follows. The element of revolution is to be understood as any unit of time of a longer duration, which can possibly be compared to an Earth year. What does the term irradiation of the planet mean? Naturally, the effect of a kind of radiant energy that causes ionization. Which planet is it? This is not entirely certain, since the section belongs to the reconstructed sections, to a part of the report that was previously completely illegible. Certain indications, however, suggest that it is our planet, Earth. What purpose could such irradiation serve? Nothing definite can be said about this either. The unknown beings apparently express the intention of directing enormous energy concentrations against the Earth. When the impact subsides after a certain time, the great movement is supposed to begin. If the term great movement is to be understood as an invasion of our planet, then this passage can have only one meaning. The unknown beings are pursuing the goal of destroying all terrestrial life in order to settle on Earth themselves. All of this sounds fantastic and improbable, and the physicists and individual links in the chain of thought from which conclusions about the invasion of Earth emerged are only loosely connected. Nevertheless, in this situation, since it concerns something completely unknown in history, namely a threat to all of humanity, one should not be overly critical and should not apply the strictest scientific rigor in one's assessment. This is such an enormous danger that its possibility must be investigated even if it seems highly improbable. After Professor Lao Tzu had finished his remarks, the chairman, Professor Raymond E. Cowell, took the floor and urged those present to remain calm and collected. Then the discussion began. Some of the scholars considered the conclusions drawn to be correct in themselves, but took the view that the situation did not appear threatening at all. This spaceship had only been a first scout. and a mass invasion of Earth would certainly have been considered only after a safe return from this expedition. However, due to the catastrophe, the danger, if it ever existed, must have passed. They cited the fact that almost 100 years had passed in complete peace since then as the best proof of this. Other scholars pointed out that a few dozen years only represent a relatively long period of time by human standards. It could just as well be the case, they argued, that one revolution corresponds to several centuries. The unknown beings could, after all, be very long-lived creatures. Where was the certainty that they did not measure their existence in thousands of years? The chairman asked the members of the first section to give their opinion on the nature of the unknown beings, the wanderers from outer space, who had suddenly transformed into mortal enemies of humanity. Professor Chandrasekhar, delegated by the biologists, presented his reasoning to the assembly. One of the physicists then remarked that the problem might have been approached from the very beginning under the completely false assumptions. Perhaps a spaceship was nothing but a giant mechanical brain endowed with the initiative and the capacity for independent action. The creators, therefore, did not need to have been on board. With such an understanding, all the peculiarities of the report turned out to be characteristic of the mechanical brain that had recorded it, and virtually nothing was known about the unknown beings. The whole matter was returned to its starting point. The Translation Committee found itself in an incredibly difficult situation. How should it address the problem of a possible invasion? Was humanity actually in danger? It was quite possible that the unknown beings had once intended to colonize Earth, but were these intentions even feasible? At 1 a.m., the chairman interrupted the discussion. He concluded by declaring that the next meeting would not take place for another 2 days, and that the group of astrophysicists, reinforced by the best mathematicians, would probably already be able to present new facts regarding the origin of the unknown beings to the General Assembly. Almost no one knew that the astrophysicists had been working since midnight of the previous day, that is, from the moment the Presidium of the Commission had learned of the last section of the report. On the top floor of the Mathematical Institute, 11 scholars, isolated from the outside world, were working continuously. For the time that Lao Tzu and Chandrasekhar were working, at the general meeting of the Translation Commission, the astrophysicist Arsenyat led the work carried out with the electronic brain. He compared the numerical values of the rocket's trajectory, its probable speed and propulsive energy, with the star maps of 1908. This extraordinarily difficult calculation, which involved constantly selecting a few specific values from hundreds of thousands of possible ones, was solved after 29 hours of tireless work. A day and a half after that memorable meeting, at which the members of the Commission heard the ominous message from space, 3 scientists stood in front of the electronic brain's fluorescent screen and read the last characters of the result. They looked at each other in silence. Arseniev approached and peered once more into the shimmering opening of the cathode screen. There could be no doubt now. The rocket had been launched from our solar system and from a planet whose orbit lay within Earth. Therefore, only 2 were possible, Mercury and Venus. The scientists once again leaned over the metal tables. Brief words were exchanged. On the control panels, the white buttons of the contacts rose and fell. With a barely perceptible noise, thousands of new circuits began operating. In the wide slots of the control panels, the control lamps glowed crimson. When the last white lines trembled on the fluorescent screens, everything was clear. Mercury was out of the question. This volcanic planet composed of ash and lava is closest to the Sun and always faces the same hemisphere. Mercury lacks an atmosphere. All that remains is the planet shrouded in bright, white clouds, whose surface has always been hidden from the human eye. The morning and evening star, Venus.